Well, howdy, hi, and welcome back to the last installment of Island of the Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell. Mr. Phillips here, and I certainly have been enjoying reading this book. I hope you've been enjoying reading it too. It's a good one. I love it. Boy, that last installment, what we read, what was it, chapters 25, 26, and 27? There's a terrible earthquake, a tsunami. She was almost swept off the rocks by a giant wave. Ron2 died. Boy, that was action-packed. A lot happened in those 3 chapters, and they were short. And she got another pet, remember? Son of Ron2. Yeah. So a lot happened. Now she's been on the island for years and years. Well, today we're going to finish the book. So, I don't know, I'll kind of miss it. It's always kind of sad when you finish a book. You kind of almost wish it could keep going. So I hope you're doing well in your packet. I hope you wrote about a challenge that you did. I hope you wrote good summaries of the chapters and finished up your packet. Best time to do the packet is right after you read or hear me read. That way it's fresh in your head. So here we go, chapters 28 and 29, and they're pretty short. And I'm also going to read the introduction and a little bit about the author after I finish. So here we go. Chapter 28. The earthquake did little damage. Even the spring, which failed to flow for several days, started up again and flowed more than ever. But the great waves had cost me all the food and weapons which were stored in the cave, as well as the canoe I had been working on, and those hidden under the south cliffs. The canoes were the biggest loss. To find enough wood to make another would have taken me all spring and summer. I therefore set out on the first fair morning to search for whatever wreckage the waves had washed ashore. Among the rocks near the south cliffs, I found a part of one canoe, buried in sand and twisted kelp. I worked all morning to dig it free, and then, having scraped it clean, could not decide what to do. I could cut the sinews and carry the planks up the cliff 2 at a time on my back and across the dunes to Coral Cave, which meant many days. Or I could build the canoe here on the rocks and take the chance that another storm would wash it away before I was finished. I finally did neither of these things. Choosing a day when the sea was calm, I floated what was left of the canoe and pushed it in front of me and made my way past the sand spit and into the cove. There, I took the wreckage apart and moved the planks up the trail beyond the place where the great waves had reached. I found the remains of my other canoe. It had been washed far back in the cave, and I could not get it out. So I went to the south cliffs and hunted among the piles of kelp until I had enough pieces of wood, counting what I already had, to begin the building of another. It was late in the spring now. The weather was still unsettled with light rain falling most of the days. But I started the new canoe anyway, for I needed to gather shellfish. No longer did I think of the Aleuts, as I have said, yet without a canoe to go where I wanted, I felt uneasy. The planks were all about the same size, the length of my arm, but they came from different canoes, and therefore were hard to fit together. The holes were already, however, which saved me much labor and time. Another help was that the great waves had washed ashore long strings of black pitch, which was often difficult to find on the island and which I needed. When I had sorted out the planks and shaped them, the work went fast, so that by late spring I was ready to finish the seams. It was on a windy morning that I made a fire to soften the pitch. The wind was cold, and it took a long time to get the fire going. To hasten it, I went down to the beach for dry seaweed. I had started back with my arms filled when I turned to look at the sky, thinking from the feel of the wind that a storm might be close. Off to the north, the skies were clear, but in the east, from whence storms sometimes came at this season, stood banks of great clouds, one on top of another. At this moment, in the deep shadows cast by the clouds, I saw something else. Forgetting that I was carrying a load of seaweed, I threw up my arms. The seaweed fell to the ground. A sail! A ship! Was there on the sea, halfway between the horizon and the shore. By the time I had reached the headland, it was much closer, moving quickly on the strong wind. I could see it did not have the red, beaked prow of the Aleuts, nor did it look like the white men's ship, which I clearly remembered. Why had it come to the island of the Blue Dolphins? I crouched on the headland and wondered, my heart beating fast, if the men who sailed it had come to catch otter. If they were hunters, I must hide before they saw me. They would soon find my fire and the canoe I was making, yet I could go to the cave and probably be safe from them. But if they had been sent by my people to take me away, then I should not hide. The ship moved slowly between the black rocks and into Coral Cove. I could see the men now, and they were not Aleuts. They lowered a canoe, and 2 of the men paddled toward the beach. The wind had begun to blow hard, and the men had trouble landing. Finally, one of them stayed behind in the canoe, and the other, the man without a beard, jumped into the water and came along the beach and up the trail. I could not see him, but after a while I heard a shout, and then another, and I knew that he had found my fire in the canoe. The man he had left in the cove did not answer, nor did the men on the ship, so I was sure that he was calling to me. I crawled down from the rock and I went to the house. Since my shoulders were bare, I put on my otter cape. I took my cormorant skirt and the abalone box in which I kept my necklace and earrings. With Rantu Aru and I then went along the trail that led to Coral Cove. I came to the mound where my ancestors had sometimes camped in the summer. I thought of them and of the happy time I spent in my house on the headland and of my canoe lying unfinished beside the trail. I thought of many things, but stronger was the wish to be where my people lived, to hear their voices and their laughter. I left the mound and the green grass growing on it among the white shells. I could no longer hear the man calling, so I began to run. When I came to the place where the 2 trails met, where I had built my fire, I found the footsteps the man had left. I followed them down to the cove. The canoe had gone back to the ship. The wind was screaming now, and mist blew in across the harbor, and waves began to pile up on the shore. I raised my hand and shouted. I shouted over and over, but the wind carried my voice away. I ran down the beach and waded into the water. The men did not see me. Rain started to fall, and the wind drove it against my face. I waded farther out through the waves, raising my arms to the ship. Slowly, it moved away in the mist. It went toward the south. I stood there until it was out of sight. Oh my gosh, I think they were there to get her. They were calling for somebody. It must have been her. Got back in their ship and sailed away. Chapter 29. This is the last chapter. After 2 more springs had gone, on the morning of white clouds and calm seas, the ship came back. At dawn, I saw it from the headland far out on the horizon. When the sun was overhead, it lay anchored in Coral Cove. Until the sun went down, I watched from the headland while the men made a camp on the shore and built a fire. And then I went to my house. All night I did not sleep, thinking of the man who had once called to me. I had thought of his voice calling for a long time, since the night of the storm when the ship had sailed away. Every day during those 2 springs and 2 summers, I had gone to the headland and watched, always at dawn and again at dusk. In the morning, I smelled smoke from their fire. I went down to the ravine and bathed in the spring and put on my otter cape and my cormorant skirt. I put on the necklace of black stone and the black earrings. With blue clay, I made a mark of our tribe across my nose. And then I did something that made me smile at myself. I did what my older sister Ulap had done when she left the island of the Blue Dolphins. Below the mark of our tribe, I carefully made the sign which meant that I was still unmarried. I was no longer a girl, and yet I made it anyway, using the blue clay and some white clay for the dots. I went back to the house then and built a fire and cooked food for Rantu Aru and me. I was not hungry, and he ate my food and his too. "We are going away," I said to him, "away from our island." But he only put his head to one side, as his father often had done, and when I said no more, he trotted out to a sunny place and lay down and fell asleep. Now that the white men had come back, I could not think of what I would do when I went across the sea, or make a picture in my mind of the white men and what they did there, or see my people who had been gone so long. Nor thinking of the past, of the many summers and winters and springs that had gone, could I see each of them. They were all one, a tight feeling in my breast, and nothing more. The morning was full of sun. The wind smelled of the sea and the things that lived in it. I saw the men long before they saw the house on the headland, far off on the dunes to the south. There were 3 of them, 2 tall men and one who was short and wore a long gray robe. They left the dunes and came along the cliff, and then, seeing the smoke from the fire which I kept burning, they followed it, and at last reached my house. I crawled under the fence and stood facing them. The man in the gray robe had a string of beads around his neck, and at the end of it was an ornament of polished wood. He raised his hand and made a motion toward me, which was the shape of the ornament he wore. And then one of the 2 men who stood behind him spoke to me. His words made the strangest sounds I have ever heard. At first I wanted to laugh, but I bit my tongue. I shook my head and smiled at him. He spoke again, slowly this time, and though his words sounded the same as before and meant nothing to me, they now seemed sweet. They were the sounds of a human voice. There is no sound like this in all the world. The man lifted his hand and pointed toward the cove and made a picture in the air of what could have been a ship. To this I nodded, and myself pointed to the 3 baskets I had placed by the fire, making a gesture of taking them with me to the ship, also in the cage in which I had put 2 young birds. There were many gestures before we left, though the 2 men spoke among themselves. They liked my necklace, the cape, and the cormorant skirt that shone in the sun. But when we got to the beach where their camp was, the first thing the man who spoke the most did was to tell the other men to make me a dress. I knew this is what he said because one of them stood up in front of me and held up a string from my neck to my feet and across my shoulders. The dress was blue. It was made of 2 trousers, just like those the white men were wearing. The trousers were cut up into pieces, and then one of the men sat down on the rock and put them together again with white string. He had a long nose, which looked like the needle he used. He sat all afternoon on the rock, and the needle went back and forth, in and out, flashing in the sun. From time to time, he would hold up the dress and nod his head as if he were pleased. I nodded as if I was pleased too, but I was not. I wanted to wear my cormorant skirt and my otter cape, which were much more beautiful than the thing he was making. The dress reached from my throat to my feet. I did not like it, either the color of it or the way it scratched. It was also hot, but I smiled and put my cormorant skirt away in one of the baskets to wear when I got across the sea, sometime when the men were not around. The ship stayed in Coal Cove 9 days. It had come for otter, but the otter had gone. Some must have been left, after all, who remember the Aleuts, for on that morning there were none to be seen. I knew where they had gone. They had gone to Tall Rock, but when the men showed me the weapons they had brought to kill the otter, I shook my head, and I acted as though I did not understand. They pointed to my otter cape, but still I shook my head. I asked them then about the ship that had taken my people away many years before, making the signs of the ship and pointing to the east, but they did not understand. Not until I came to Mission Santa Barbara and met Father Gonzalez did I learn from him that this ship had sunk in a great storm soon after it reached his country, and that on the whole ocean thereabouts there was no other. For this reason, the white men had not come back for me. On the 10th day we sailed. It was a morning of blue skies and no wind. We went straight toward the sun. For a long time I stood and looked back at the island of the Blue Dolphins. The last thing I saw of it was the high headland. I thought of Rontu lying there beneath the stones of many color, and of Wanani, wherever she was, and of the little red fox that would scratch in vain at my fence, and my canoe hidden in the cave, and of all the happy days. Dolphins rose out of the sea and swam before the ship. They swam for many leagues in the morning through the bright water, weaving their foamy pattern. The little birds were chirping in their cage, and Rantu Aru sat beside me. And that's it. She's on the ship. She's going back to Santa Barbara. We know she made it there because she mentioned she talked to Father Gonzalez, so she made it to the Catholic mission there. I think one of the men in the robe who made a sign, same as on his neck, the beaded necklace, must have been a priest. I think he made the sign of the cross. So he was probably a Catholic priest. Wow. You're going to write in your packet, what is home to you? That's such a good question. Such a good question. What is home to her? Is it Island of the Blue Dolphins, or is it where her people are? Home is an interesting thing when you think about it. Where is home? Where your family is? Where you sleep at night? What's home to her? The island or Santa Barbara? Interesting. How about that ending? Are you satisfied with it? Do you like the way it ended? Or would you rather, she got to the land and then she saw her family and her sister? And that would have been kind of neat to see, but we didn't get to see any of that. We're not quite sure what happened. So that's also in your packet. Are you satisfied with the ending? So I hope you do a good job on the packet and read all about it. Hey, I wanted to read a couple of more things because they're in the book and they're good to have. This one's called Author's Note, and it's at the very end of the book. And the author, of course, is Scott O'Dell. So here's him talking directly to us. Author's Note. The island called, in this book, the Island of the Blue Dolphins, was first settled by Indians in about 2000 BC, but it was not discovered by white men until 1602. In that year, the Spanish explorer Sebastian Vizcaino, I'm probably saying that wrong, set out from Mexico in search of a port where treasure galleons from the Philippines could find shelter in case of distress. Sailing north along the California coast, he sighted the islands and sent a small boat ashore and named it La Isla de San Nicolas in honor of the patron saint of sailors, travelers, and merchants. As centuries passed, that's hundreds of years, California changed from Spanish to Mexican hands, and the Americans arrived, but only occasionally hunters visited the island. Its Indian inhabitants remained in isolation. That means they were all alone. The girl Robinson Crusoe, whose story I have attempted to recreate, actually lived alone upon the island. Robinson Crusoe is an older book about a guy who lived alone on an island. So he's kind of sounding like, he made up this story about this girl living on this island. So she's kind of like Robinson Crusoe. I have attempted to recreate, actually lived alone upon this island from 1835 to 1853, and is known to history as the Lost Woman of San Nicolas. The facts about her are few. From the reports of Captain Hubbard, whose schooner carried away the Indians of Galasat, we know that the girl did jump into the sea, despite efforts to restrain her. From records left by Captain Nidever, we do know that he found her 18 years later, alone with a dog in a crude house on the headland, dressed in a skirt of cormorant feathers. Father Gonzalez of Santa Barbara Mission, who befriended her after her rescue, learned that her brother had been killed by wild dogs. He learned little else, for she spoke to him only in signs. Neither he nor the many Indians at the mission could understand her strange language. The Indians of Galasat had long since disappeared. The lost woman of San Nicolas is buried on a hill near the Santa Barbara Mission. Her skirt of green cormorant feathers was sent to Rome. Outermost of the Channel Islands, San Nicolas is about 75 miles southwest of Los Angeles. For years, historians thought it had been settled some 6 centuries ago, but recent carbon-14 tests of excavation on the island show that Indians came here from the north long before the Christian era. Their images of the creatures of the land, sea, and air, similar to those found on the shores of Alaska and carved with extraordinary skill, may be seen at the Southwest Museum in Los Angeles. The future of San Nicolas is not clear. It is now a secret base of the United States Navy, but scientists predict that because of the pounding waves and furious winds, it will one day be swept back into the sea. In the writing of The Island of the Blue Dolphins, I am deeply indebted to Maud and Delos Lovelace, to Bernice Eastman Johnson of Southwest Museum, and to Fletcher Carr, former curator of the San Diego Museum of Man. So it really was a true story. There really was the woman of the sea out there all by herself for 18 years. Hey, I also wanted to read the introduction. So go to the very, very beginning of the book. And, you know, an introduction is something you should read at the beginning, right? But I didn't want to read it at the beginning. I thought it gave away too much of the story. So I just wanted to read the story on its own, and then I knew I would read the introduction at the end. So here's the introduction. You can read along if you want. Entry 1183, recorded by Father Gonzales Rubio in the Santa Barbara Mission Book of Burials, reads, on October 19th, 1853, I gave ecclesiastical burial in the cemetery to the remains of Juana Maria, the Indian woman brought from the San Nicolas Island, and since there was no one who could understand her language, she was baptized conditionally by Father Sanchez. Thus she became known to history as Juana Maria. It had never been her name. Sometimes, too, she is called the Lone Woman of San Nicolas, but most often she's remembered now as Carana, the name that Scott O'Dell gave to her when he wrote her story. Sadly, she was never able to tell her story herself, for her language was one that no one could comprehend. So the details were pieced together, guessed at, fabricated, romanticized at times, and embroidered in retelling. What is known is this: for thousands of years, the Nicolino tribe had lived peacefully on a tiny 3-by-9 mile island about 70 miles off the coast of Southern California. In 1811, a Russian American trading company, led by an American captain, hired a group of Alaskan Aleuts and deposited them on the island of San Nicolas to hunt sea otters, whose pelts were highly prized. When the native Nicolios objected, they were massacred. That means they were killed. Some accounts say that the Aleuts then left the island. Others speculate that they were killed by the women whose husbands they had slaughtered. By 1835, there were very few of the original natives left on San Nicolas, and those who remained, it is generally agreed, were, all but one, female. The woman who was later to be baptized on her deathbed with the name Juana Maria would have been one of these. The Santa Barbara Mission sponsored a rescue operation and sent a schooner and its crew to collect the few remaining Nicoloians for their own safety. They grouped the small band of natives on the beach and then took them aboard the ship. But they left behind one woman. The versions of why this happened vary. The simplest: a storm was coming and they had to hurry, and one woman didn't make it to the beach in time. A little embellishment: the woman was with a group on the beach but ran off to find her missing child, and the crew, with the strong storm beginning, couldn't wait. The most romantic account: she was already on the ship when she realized her child was not among them, and she dived overboard and swam back. Whatever the circumstances, this was the moment when an unnamed woman became the Lone Woman of San Nicolas. She remained on the island alone for 18 years. If indeed she had a child, it did not survive. Records show that when she was found in 1853 by fur trapper George Nedever, she was dressed in a skirt made of green cormorant feathers. Nedever described her as about 50. All other accounts say she was maybe in her 30s. All of them describe her as smiling. A Sacramento newspaper reported, "The wild woman who was found on the island of San Nicolas, about 70 miles from the coast west of Santa Barbara, is now at the latter place and is looked upon as a curiosity. It is stated she has been some 18 to 20 years alone on the island. She existed on shellfish and the fat of the seal, and dressed in the skins and feathers of wild ducks, which she sewed together with the sinews of the seals. She cannot speak any known language, is good-looking, and about middle-aged. She seems to be contented in her new home among the good people of Santa Barbara." And that's all we will ever know. In the short time remaining to her, she died 7 weeks later, succumbing to illness as her predecessors had. No linguist could identify her language or translate the words of the 2 songs she sang for them. I knew Scott O'Dell, not well, but certainly well enough to have asked him questions, and yet I failed to do so. And as has happened before when I've lost people whose wisdom I valued, I am left with regret that I could only guess what the answers might have been. How did he decide on the age she would be in the book? Clearly, he realized that telling the truer story of a grown woman with a child would be less appealing to the young audience he intended. And so he began with, "My brother Rama was a little boy only half my age, which was 12. A young girl, still a child herself. She laughs at her older sister who paints her face with the emblem of a not yet married woman and calls her vain. The protagonist faces the challenges of growing up that all 12-year-olds do. What a heartbreak to have her face them all alone, without peers or parents, without guidance or counselor. And how would he compress the 18 years of her isolated life into a compact and coherent story? Mr. Odell masterfully lulls the reader into what I can only describe as island time, without clocks or calendars. We've only the seasons and the sea to measure by. Many chapters begin with a sense of both time passing and the endlessness of its passage. The white man's ship did not return that spring or in the summer. Flowers were plentiful that spring because of the winter's heavy rains. Another summer had come, and still I had not speared the giant devilfish. Spring again was a time of flowers, and water ran on the ravines. After the fierce storms of winter came many days when the wind did not blow. Did he comprehend, starting out, the challenge it would be to tell a story that only has one human character? Most of us rely on dialogue and relationships to define the people in our books, to portray their change and growth. Yet after the death of the protagonist's brother, the reader must depend entirely on the interior voice of a solitary, uneducated girl. The author makes that voice so clear, so convincing, that we learn and mature as she does. I wondered what would happen to me if I went against the law of our tribe, which forbade the making of weapons by women. If I did not think of it at all and made those things which I must have to protect myself. And too, he has created characters and company out of wild creatures and the natural landscape itself. It is as if Karana speaks to the sea, confides in the cliffs, whispers to the wind and to the yellow-eyed gray dog, the fearsome enemy that she tames to friendship. Because of all this, I was not lonely. I did not know how lonely I had been until I had Rantu to talk to. This is a book that is really about the things most meaningful to young readers, what we are all capable of, if called upon. The question of what home is and means, and what our relationship is to the natural world. More than anything, it was the blue dolphins that took me back home. My 2 grandsons and I swam this summer with dolphins. They were not blue. They were shimmery gray-white, and the sense of their massive power and their restraint was overwhelming. It's so easy to believe in their benevolence once they've nudged against you and invited your affection with their smooth, glistening smiles. Rereading The Island of the Blue Dolphins, I could believe in their blueness too, in the foaming patterns that they wove in the sea as they guided the boat through bright water. The blue dolphins left me shortly before dusk. They left as quickly as they had come, going on into the west, but for a long time I could see the last of the sun shining on them. After night fell, I could still see them in my thoughts. Me too. Thank you, Scott Odell. Lois Lowry, Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that's the introduction. It was written by Lois Lowry, who's another author. And if you're looking for some good books to read, you might try something by Lois Lowry. She's written a lot of good books for young people, for anybody. Well, that's it. We did the whole thing. We read it all. I hope you're almost done with your packet, and I hope you're doing a good job. I hope you're going to do a good job about writing about that ending. Are you satisfied? Did it tell you everything you wanted to know, or do you wish there was a little bit more to it? I don't know. I've got some questions I wish could get answered. Well, I certainly enjoyed reading that, and thank you so much to the 4th grade teachers at Castory and to the 4th grade students for listening. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll keep reading. Great thing you can do. It's just the best thing for your brain. Just keep reading. You might want to try something else by Scott Odell, but there's a lot of great authors out there. So until I see you around, I'll see you around. Thanks again. Adios, my friends.